Welcome to Lesson 5.7, Implementing Access Control Techniques and Technologies. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Identity and Access Management domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge E, which is Implement and Manage Authorization Mechanisms. Our topics are going to include Access Control Lists, Capabilities Tables, Rule-Based, Content-Based, Context-Based, and Constrained Interface Access Controls. So access control techniques and technologies can be used to implement and supplement MAC, DAC, and RBAC. Remember, MAC was mandatory access control, DAC was discretionary access control, and RBAC was role-based access control. Our access control techniques include access control matrices, rule-based access control, content-based access controls, context-based access controls, and constrained interfaces. Access permissions can be an attribute of a subject or an object. And an access control matrix is a table of subjects and objects indicating what action can be taken, so effectively the relationship between the subject and the object. And access control lists are used when the access permissions are an object attribute. So when we're focused on the object and we're assigning the permissions at the object level. A capabilities table is used when access permissions are a subject attribute. So we're saying here's the subject and here are all the things that a subject can do. So access control lists are an object attribute. Capabilities tables are a subject attribute. Let's look at each of these. This is a very simple access control list, often referred to as an ACL. Again, the access control lists are bound to the object. So we may have an access control list for the folder 2015 reports. And for that folder, we'll say Mary can read and write, Bob has full control, and Tom has no access. But it's bound to the object. And in this case, the 2015 reports is our object. So a simple access control list, or any access control list for that matter, is bound to the object. A capabilities table, and again, we're going to look at a very simple example here. Capabilities tables are bound to the subject. So here, instead of focusing on the file or the object, we're focusing on the subject, or in this case, the user Mary. So we're saying Mary has read-write to the 2015 reports folder, has read-only to the marketing folder, and has full control to the file confidential.doc. So capabilities tables are bound to the subject, where we saw access control lists were bound to the object. We can also use rule-based access controls to assign access permissions. Rule-based access controls are situational if-then statements. Rule-based access controls are not bound to the identity, so they're not subject-bound at all. They are based on very specific situations and what would happen in those situations. Rule-based access controls are compulsory, and the user cannot modify the controls. Rules can be based on time, size, location, content, a URL, or any other uniform attribute. And rules can be combined. So let's look at a simple rule example, just combining a few. We may have some very simple rules that if it's between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., then allow. Now this rule could be allow you to log in, allow you to access the internet. Really what it's allowing to do is not as relevant for our discussion, just what the rule says. So in this case, if it's between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., allow. The subject doesn't matter who the subject is. It's really situational. Now we may have rules where we go down a list and we have to meet a number of conditions. So then we may say if the source IP address is 10.10.10.1, well then deny. So all other addresses would be fine, but if we hit 10.10.10.1, we're going to have to deny. And then maybe we're saying if the URL is www.informit.com, then allow. So these are situational if-then statements. We can have one that's a little bit more complex. Again, this is still on the simple side of complex, this example. But a complex rule could have a lot of Booleans. It could have ands and ors. We can also have if and thens. So if an email contains the word confidential, or the email has an attachment greater than a meg, and the recipient domain is not on the trusted domain list, then quarantine the message and send an alert. So we have a number of different factors that come into play, and if all of these conditions are met, or as these conditions are met, certain rules are enforced. We can have content-dependent access control, and content-dependent access control is used to filter based upon the data being acted upon. Now, filtering can be accomplished by the use of, and this is just an example, by maybe email keywords, maybe social security number, or email strings. Maybe we have what looks like social security numbers in it, or maybe website categories. Again, so the first two examples are if we were using email, the third example is if we were doing web browsing, but it's based on the data being acted on. So if we're trying to send an email, and the email either has a keyword SSN or a string that would appear to be a social security number, we're going to filter access. If the website is categorized as a shopping site or a pornography site or a gambling site, again, we're going to filter. So content-dependent access control is a filtering technique, and it's based on the data that's being acted on. Context-dependent access control makes decisions on a collection or sequence of actions. So, for example, let's say we have an IDS, IPS, and it may decide to block a certain IP address if a particular collection or sequence. Now, these aren't rules because they're not hard and fast. These are very dynamic, and it depends upon the aggregation of what's happening to determine what the appropriate content-dependent access control would be. So let's look at an example. The IDS IPS may decide to block certain IP addresses if it's receiving thousands of HTTP GET requests per second from multiple IP addresses within a specific IP range. So if it's doing all of these things, then the IDS IPS may say we're going to block that, and so there will be no access. It's not a rule. It's not based on if it is receiving thousands stop or from multiple IP addresses stop. It is very dynamic, and it depends upon the context that this activity is taking place within. And lastly, we have constrained interfaces. And constrained interfaces restrict subjects by not allowing them to request certain functions or to have access to certain information or resources, or even allowing them to know that an option exists. So the interface, right, is just what's presented to the subject or the user, and we're restricting them by what they can see. There are three major types of constrained interfaces. One is menus and shells. So when you get to an application, it's what can you see, what menus are presented to you, and what choices on those menus. So by restricting what menus or shell you can see, now we're restricting what your access is. The second is database views. In a database, we can restrict views so that the subject, in a database, we can restrict views so that the subject can only see certain fields, or perhaps only certain queries, or even only certain reports. And then we have physically constrained interfaces. Physically constrained interfaces are when you go to an interface and only certain things will show up. And a great example would be an ATM. When you go to an ATM as a user, you put your card in and punch in your code, and then you're only given certain choices. But there are quite a few more things you can do with the ATM, but you're physically constrained from not seeing those. That's all that's being presented to you. So let's do a Lesson 5-7 review. We started with talking about access control matrices, and we talked about access control lists. And access control lists are when the permissions are bound to the object. We then looked at capabilities tables, and that's when permissions are bound to the subject. We looked at rule-based, which are conditional if-then statements. We don't modify those, and they are not based on who the subject is. It's really based on do you match the conditions of the rule or not. We have content dependent, which depends upon the data that's being accessed. That's where we looked at filtering rules, filtering out social security numbers or going to pornography sites or gambling sites. We have context dependent, which really is very dynamic and depends upon what's going on. And lastly, we have constrained interfaces, which include menus, shells, database views, and physically constrained interfaces. That brings us to Lesson 5.7, Match the Meaning. These are the terms that I want to make sure you're really comfortable and very familiar with. ACL, Access Control List, Capabilities Table, Rule-Based, Content-Dependent, Context-Dependent, and a Constrained Interface. Remember that the terms on the right-hand side may be meanings or they just may be describing the functionality. So what you're going to do is you're going to put me on pause, you're going to match the meaning. When you're ready, come on back and we'll go through them together. So let's go through lesson 5.7 terms. An ACL, an access control list, that's an object-focused table, where we're looking at the object and then we are assigning subject permissions to the object. A capabilities table is a subject-focused table, where we're focusing on the subject and we're saying here are all the object permissions that the user has. Rule-based is criteria that's independent of identity, so it could be time, could be location, but it's not based on the identity of the subject. Content dependent is filters that are generally based on preset strings or categories. Context dependent is decisions based on a group or sequence of events. And a constrained interface is either denial due to inaccessibility or presentation. So that brings us to our CISSP exam tips. Remembering first that rules are not bound to a subject or an object. They are not identity-based. Second was ATM is an example of a constrained interface. And lastly, ACLs and capabilities tables are generally cumulative. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.